Welcome, everybody. We're absolutely delighted to be here with all of you today. My name is Catherine Wiseman-Hakes, and I've had the pleasure of working with Karen and Chris really since 2015 when I participated in one of your annual conferences along with other individuals who work in the brain injury field. And so I've been really pleased to have the opportunity to continue to work with Karen and Chris over the last few years. I would like to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Lynn Turkstra. Lynn, do you want to just do a wave there? And Julie Osbelt, and I'll introduce them as we go. Okay. Okay, now okay, so that is who we are. So we're delighted that you're here. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background. I had a very proud moment not too long ago. Lynn and I sit on a group of primarily US-based brain injury professionals who do a lot of work in supporting youth in the justice system with brain injury, increasing awareness, trying to impact policy, doing research, etc. And recently, I was invited to participate in a webinar on youth justice and brain injury, and I represented the Canadian viewpoint. And I had an opportunity to meet with Karen and Chris and some other individuals prior to that webinar. And when I actually got to doing the webinar representing the Canadian perspective, I was able to say just how proud I was to be part of to working with people in the youth justice system, particularly the probation and parole officers who are so incredibly dedicated and forward thinking and who genuinely want the best for your clients. And I truly use those words, that I was really proud to work with all of you. So that's the spirit in which we're beginning today. I will just tell you very briefly. So I am a speech language pathologist by training. I've worked my whole career in the field of traumatic and acquired brain injury. I teach with Lynn in the Department of Speech Language Pathology at McMaster University. And I've always had a particular interest in youth with brain injury. And over the last few years, I've been working in the field of vulnerable individuals in brain injury in the criminal justice system. Lynn, did you want to just say a very quick introduction? And Julie, I'm going to ask you to do that too before we move on.
Sure, Catherine. So hello, everyone. And I'm also very grateful that you're here today. And I think you could just put my name in for Catherine's name and say pretty much the same thing. So I'm a speech language pathologist and have spent my career as well working in mostly traumatic brain injury, special interest in adolescents and young adults. I'm the head of the graduate program in speech language pathology at MAC, which I have been for the last 4 years. And I also have an interest, as does Catherine, in intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury. So thank you for being here, and I'll pass it over to Julie.
Okay, Julie.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Catherine. So I'm Julie Osbelt, and I work for the Toronto Acquired Brain Injury Network. And I'm coming here today as the Toronto Central ABI System Navigator, which is another hat that I wear, as well as I'm the ABI Referral Coordinator. And so I've been in the field of ABI for about 20 years now, and I started out primarily with youth, working through the Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. And then the last 8 years I've been at the Toronto ABI Network, which I will describe a little bit later. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. All right. Why exactly are we here today? Well, we're here because we know, and I'm sure that most of you know, that you are encountering young people with traumatic brain injury in your job. And it's increasingly on the radar for frontline staff all across the justice system, for those who work both with youth and adults. But we also know that this is not necessarily reflected in your training. It's not reflected in policy. It's not reflected in approaches to screening. And it's not reflected in your assessment, management, and approaches to community reintegration. The second point is that traumatic brain injury can be, and most often is, invisible. So most people with brain injuries look like everyone else. It's very difficult to distinguish. And so it's likely not going to be identified through routine screening measures that you would be using or in any justice system documents. And one of the aims that Lynn and I are working on right now through a grant that we have through the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, who are the very generous funders of this particular webinar as well, is to try and implement screening for traumatic brain injury for all youth that come in contact with the justice system. And we hope that as we go through here, you'll understand why that's so important. So the next, of course, is that traumatic brain injury can affect all aspects of the youth's involvement with the justice system, including your work as probation officers. And we're going to talk to you today about what are the symptoms or sequelae or outcomes of brain injury that would impact their trajectory across the justice system and your work. So really the aim of this webinar is to provide you with the background information and knowledge that you need to help you understand, manage, provide appropriate resources for your clients with traumatic brain injury. So we also know that there really is a general lack of awareness about the impact of TBI, which is interesting because what you may not realize is that traumatic brain injury is actually more common than HIV, AIDS, and breast cancer combined. And it is in fact the leading cause of death and disability for young people in the industrial world. So there's a real lack of awareness, and because of that, there are a lot of environmental and attitudinal barriers that you'll learn about as we go through the webinar. Also, lack of information, and as a result, a lot of individuals, particularly those in the justice system, can become marginalized and at risk. And so this, again, can affect practice and case management. So as I said, our aim with this webinar is to provide you with the background knowledge. Because Lynn and I are both speech language pathologists, we are going to have a heavy emphasis on communication and cognitive abilities and supporting you in terms of what are the strategies that you can use as a probation officer to support your clients, and how we can also modify the environment to facilitate communication. So we're going to be giving you strategies. We're also going to be providing you with resources to help you work effectively with youth and with your older clients. Pretty much everything that we say, we know a lot of you are working in the adult world, will apply to them as well. All right. So I'm hopeful that many of you might be familiar with the Youth Justice Outcomes Framework, which was developed for the Ontario Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services back in 2016. And these are essentially the preambles to the justice system. So by understanding brain injury, we are able to hopefully improve functioning and positive social behaviors. Again, that's a big part of the work that Lynn and I do. Increased skills and abilities, increased youth engagement with supports, and ultimately to decrease reoffending and recidivism in this particular population. Because we know that if youth and adults with brain injuries are supported properly, that they can absolutely lead meaningful and positive lives. So we're trying to also ensure that young people can fully participate in the justice system. There are a number of challenges associated with brain injury that we're going to talk about that really impact their ability to participate effectively and advocate for themselves, understand the language, etc. The second point is that we would really like to ensure that young people have access to appropriate rehabilitation and habilitation services. And we would like to suggest that this again be built in all across the justice system, perhaps whether it's conditions of bail, probation, parole for older adults, etc. And I also just wanted to clarify, by rehabilitation, we mean providing supports and interventions for challenges associated with something to return it to either pre-injury status, which is rarely the case, but to support, and habilitation, meaning building on skills that were not properly developed in the young person. The next thing is we really want people to have brain injury on the radar so that they can actually identify and understand TBI-related signs and symptoms. Because what happens is that often they're misinterpreted, oh, as a mental health challenge, or oh, that individual has a problem with their attitude, when really it may be just that they're not following or remembering what's going on. So there's a lot of misperceptions. So if we understand about traumatic brain injury and what are the signs and what are the symptoms, then we can understand the behaviors and support the behaviors. The final and very important point here too is that we are not necessarily trying to suggest that having a brain injury should diminish culpability. People, of course, need to be responsible for their behaviors, and that needs to be taken into account in the justice system. We're also not necessarily suggesting that sentences be reduced, again, unless there's particular circumstances. But what we are saying is build in a component of understanding of the brain injury and rehabilitation and habilitation and supports for these individuals. So we identified a number of learning objectives for you. And the first is to define acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury. And I will go on to do that for you. We also want you to have an understanding of just how prevalent traumatic brain injury is in justice settings, and also to identify what the risk factors are. And we're focusing on clients aged 12 to 25 years. But I will just, as an aside, mention that many adults in the justice system also have a history of childhood brain injury or brain injury from prior to going into the justice system, and the connection hasn't necessarily been made. So a childhood brain injury is also a risk factor for an adult as well. The next thing we'd like to do today is to help you to identify common cognitive and communication problems that are associated with individuals with traumatic brain injury, because again, they really impact how the person moves across the justice system. And then finally, we're going to move over to Julie, and she's going to talk with you about the role of the ABI LIN navigators. So each LIN has its own ABI navigator, and they can be a resource for you and your clients, depending on your geographic region. Okay, and then next week, we're going to talk about how these cognitive and communication problems can affect all of the interactions in the justice system. We're going to talk about that today as well, but we will have more of an emphasis on that next week. We're going to talk about the difference between skill versus will, and there's a big difference and why they matter. And then we're, again, going to support you in terms of basic strategies for effective communication. So that's our overview, and we're going to get started. All right, so our first learning objective. So what exactly is a traumatic brain injury? Well, a traumatic brain injury actually falls under the umbrella of what we call acquired brain injury, and that includes traumatic brain injury. An acquired brain injury is essentially any damage to the brain that occurs after birth and is not related to a congenital or a degenerative disease or trauma during birth. So what we have here is some images of a brain following different types of brain injury. So under this, we have traumatic brain injury, and over on the left there, you can see a lesion or a bleed, and it's actually shifted the brain. And we see this area here are called the ventricles, and the whole brain has been shifted over. This is an image of what happens following a stroke. Here we have an anoxia, which is stroke and anoxia are also acquired brain injuries. So if someone has a near drowning incident, another very unfortunate cause of anoxia is attempted strangulation in intimate partner violence. The other is what we refer to as a developmental brain injury, and that is an injury that occurs in utero or during the birth process. And fetal alcohol syndrome disorder is a developmental brain injury. And we're often asked questions about FASD as well, And I will share that all of the things that we talk about today will help you to support clients with other brain injuries as well. So a traumatic brain injury in of itself is caused by an external force applied to the brain. So it could be a bump, a blow to the head, a jolt. So even if someone is shaken or they're assaulted, that disrupts the normal function of the brain, and it can either be temporarily or permanent. So we also know that not every blow or jolt to the head does result in a traumatic brain injury. And physical contact with the actual external skull is not necessary. So in a car accident, the head does not necessarily need to hit anything for a brain injury to occur, because the skull itself has a number of bony prominences on the inside. And so just the physics and the movement of the brain rocking and shaking within the skull can cause a traumatic brain injury. And the other thing is that you don't necessarily need to lose consciousness to have sustained a brain injury, and that's another myth. Now, the other thing is that traumatic brain injury does range in terms of severity, and it can range from what we refer to as mild. And this is where we see a brief change in mental status or consciousness. And so that could be not being able to remember the last 5 minutes of what happened, or not being aware, being able to name the date, to severe, where we see individuals who have very extended periods of unconsciousness or memory loss post-injury. So one of the things that we look at is the length of time that it takes the individual to be able to return to lay down new memories. Now, the other thing is that severity is based on the level of consciousness when they're first seen by medical personnel, not in any way on the magnitude of any long-term impairments. So we know that sometimes mild brain injury is not mild, and then we also know that the cognitive status and level of consciousness can change. So this is sometimes measured a number of times as following the injury, and a person can deteriorate rapidly. So again, severity is based on the level of consciousness when first seen by the medical personnel. So as I said, we know that sometimes mild is not mild, and then we also know that individuals with severe brain injury can also lead very successful lives. So let's take a look about some Ontario statistics. So in Ontario, and this is from 2012, so it is dated now, but it is the most up-to-date that we have, 40% of injuries were from motor vehicle accidents. And I apologize that we actually use the term accident, because we actually prefer to use the term crash, because the term accident means it was not preventable. The majority of injuries are in fact preventable. So what's really unfortunate here, that statistic that 10% took more than 1 year to receive a diagnosis. So many individuals with mild brain injury don't go to emergency. And even if it's a more severe brain injury, if there are other orthopedic injuries or internal injuries, those are the ones that get focused on in the immediate moment. And it may not be until well after the fact, when people continue with symptoms, that, oh, yes, maybe in fact, this individual has had a traumatic brain injury. What's also relevant here is that we do see 3 peaks in terms of incidence and prevalence. So not surprisingly, under the age of 4, and those are primarily due to falls and unfortunately to assault, shaken baby syndrome. The next peak, again, not surprisingly, is during the age group 18 to 24 years, and the majority of those are male. And then we see another peak over the age of 65, again, due to falls in aging.
Catherine?
So the others, yes.
Oh, sorry, if I could just jump in, there was a question from Kathleen about the high rate among youth and young adults. And just to echo the point you just made about the 18 to 24 years, it's not so much an increase in impulsiveness at that age. It's a competition between having a reward-seeking brain, which is the brain of an adolescent, and not yet having the ability to control that behavior. And also something that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the incredible power of peers at that age. So there have been many studies showing that adolescents, if they even think they're being observed by another peer, will engage in much more high-risk behaviors. That's also one of the age groups where girls have been catching up to boys. So the incidence used to be 3 to 1, males to females, but now it's closer to 2 to 1. And males, I think because males did traditionally drive more and engage in more high-risk behaviors, but that has really shifted in recent years. So it's there, and also with young women in sports, in contact sports, I think the incidence has been growing relatively in females.
Thank you. Those are really important points, Lynn. Does that answer your question? I can't see the chat, so Lynn, I'll let you know if that, does that?
Okay, I'll let you know, Catherine, if not.
Okay, great. All right, so the next point here, which is also very important. So we know that traumatic brain injury has significant health disparities. I mean, brain injury happens to everyone, regardless of socioeconomic background, race, sex, gender, age. But we do know that individuals from historically disenfranchised minority populations have a much disproportionately higher incidence. And along with that, unfortunately, disproportionately less referral and access to services like rehabilitation, poor health, economic, educational, and society outcomes. And you may or may not be aware that within Toronto and Ottawa and Vancouver, there have been studies that have shown that approximately at 50% of Toronto's homeless population, and I know that it's higher in Ottawa and Vancouver, had a pre-history from prior to being homeless, traumatic brain injury. And so it's that's a particularly vulnerable population. So again, as we said here, what means that is that they don't have access, they don't get referred, they don't have necessarily family members or the education to advocate for themselves, to navigate the system, and to access the rehabilitation that they need. So that's really important because this may not, but it may fit the profile of some of the clients that you work with. So let's take a snapshot of brain injury in Ontario youth. And every time I look at this statistic, I admit I'm shocked. I am a mother of 3 young adult kids. This is actually my first year not having someone going back to school, which is an interesting life transition for me. So all my kids are in their early 20s. We've certainly had our share of concussions in our family and among my kids' friends. But when I look at this in Ontario, and this is from 2015, 1 in 5 middle and high school students reported having suffered at least one injury that knocked them unconscious for more than 5 minutes or required overnight hospitalization. So that to me is pretty staggering. What's also very unfortunate, but again, a risk factor, is that once you have a brain injury, even a concussion, we know that you're more susceptible to having an additional injury. So that's really important. So in this particular study, 1/3 of children and youth who experienced the TBI went on to have 1 or more additional injuries. And this is very important because for children, you know, we know that they have vulnerable, developing brains, and symptoms can emerge many years after the injury. And this is referred to as later developmental emergence of deficits. And why this is important, and Lynn is going to speak about this in a little bit, is that often the child may seem that they're recovering completely normally, and then adolescence may come along and behaviors may start to emerge, and no one makes the connection that it might have been due to an earlier injury. So that's an important point.
Catherine?
Yes.
There was a question about whether that statistic is the same as in other provinces, that 1 in 5 young people. And I'm not aware of that kind of data from other provinces. I can't think of a reason it would be different in Ontario. It seems like it would be similar, but go ahead, Catherine.
I think it would be similar. Again, I am not familiar with any more recent data. I suspect, again, this is me sort of pontificating here, that this would be representative of provinces that have large urban centers. It may be somewhat less in provinces that maybe have smaller cities and more rural areas, but I think it's fairly consistent across the provinces. The Brain Injury Canada website, which is one of the resources that I included in the sheet that I sent out this morning, may have some more up-to-date statistics on that, and that's certainly something that we can check for you for next week. All right, so intersectionalities. This is a very important point, and particularly most of you are probably aware that today is actually Suicide Prevention Day. And we know that traumatic brain injury significantly increases the risk of psychiatric morbidity. And we know that people with brain injuries are much more likely to experience depression and to have a suicide attempt, particularly within the first 5 years following their brain injury, than the general population. We know that it increases use of substance use. We know that it increases depression, incidence of bipolar disorder. Some individuals have post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. So often you're going to see, particularly in your own practices with your clients, we often see sort of the trilogy of brain injury, substance use, and mental health. And sometimes it's hard to tease out what is what, but we know that, as the title says, that there are intersectionalities. We also know, again, it's a chicken and egg situation here. So young people who do suffer from depression, anxiety, etc., are at higher risk for traumatic brain injury, and there are definitely risk factors for not only sustaining a brain injury, but for going on to experience persistent symptoms following even a mild brain injury or concussion. So let's also look at, again, Ontario youth, and this is actually from that same study. So they looked at a period of January to December during 2011, and they looked at 6,383 students. So that's a large sample size. And what they found is that those who had a traumatic brain injury were certainly using substances at a much greater frequency than those who did not. Now, that doesn't mean that kids without brain injuries are not using substances. Certainly in 2020, we know that, particularly in the school systems. It's pretty shocking. But the take-home message is that traumatic brain injury does not occur in isolation, and again speaks to that point about the fact that often we see the combination of brain injury, substance use, and mental health issues. Okay, so prevalence of TBI in the justice setting. Well, it's high. So some of you may be familiar with the work of Hugh Williams and the group in the United Kingdom who have studied and written extensively on this topic and do a lot of work in supporting individuals. And they did a study of offenders aged 12 to 25 years. And among incarcerated youth, so this is, again, a more severe population, the range was from 16 to 70%. So again, that's a very wide range. But for 30 to 50% of these, the traumatic brain injury predated their first incarceration. So that's the picture that we do often see. What's very unfortunate is that, well, all of this is unfortunate. I don't mean to say one or another, but that among youth who were sentenced to death, and we know this in the adult world in the United States as well, 100% have a history of brain injury. We also know that there is a higher incidence of more severe injuries among those who have more serious offenses. And so that we know that youth TBI is a particular risk factor for contact with the justice system. And the reason for that is because a childhood traumatic brain injury results in, an alteration to the developing brain. And we see a lot of changes, such as cognitive and socio-cognitive skills changes in communication abilities, changes in social or pragmatic communication, changes in impulse control, self-regulation, as well as the ability to read other people, sort of to understand where they're coming from. We refer to that as theory of mind, being able to look at someone and kind of figure out if they're joking or they're angry. And those are often challenges following a brain injury. And we know that those in of themselves are risk factors for justice involvement. So the bottom line of all of this is that you have young people with traumatic brain injury on your caseload, and you need to have the knowledge and the skills to support them appropriately. So moving on, identifying common cognitive and communication problems in clients with traumatic brain injury. So these are what we call sequelae, or outcomes following brain injury. And at this point, I'm going to turn the share over to Lynn, and she's going to walk you through the next set of slides.
So thank you, Catherine. I'm just going to talk a little about the biomechanics of brain injury, what happens to the brain, and then, as Catherine introduced, what exactly are the cognitive types of problems that young people have. And just to reiterate a point from Catherine earlier, today we focus a bit more on knowledge, and in session 2 next week, we'll focus on skills and practice some strategies in communicating. And so we'll be coming back to these same points in greater detail in next Thursday's session for those of you who are able to join. So brain injury typically has 3 types of effects. People can have focal lesions, or bruising, damaging, tearing to parts of the brain that come in contact with the skull. The inner surface of the skull has very sharp, pointy edges to it, and so the brain can be physically torn by being in contact with the skull. Also, if someone's hit by a blunt object or a missile like a bullet, a knife, that can cause focal damage to the brain. So people can have damage to the kinds of brain functions that are typically associated with that part of the brain. So that's the focal damage. The other thing that happens, though, is that when a brain is damaged, just like if you bang your knee, there's swelling. And so there can be swelling and bleeding, and that can put pressure on the brain and cause loss of oxygen to different parts of the brain. So that's called secondary damage. And that's one of the reasons people have to get to the hospital right away, because there are some drugs and some surgical treatments that can help relieve that pressure. The third thing that happens is that there's damage that's diffuse throughout the brain, just again from physics. So the brain does not have the same consistency throughout. Some parts are denser than others. And so when the whole brain moves as a unit, parts are going to be stretched relative to other parts. So you'll hear in brain injury the term diffuse axonal injury, which means diffuse damage to the connections between nerves, nerve cells, neurons in the brain. So this is one of the things that makes brain injury so complex, is that each person, because of the physics of their accident, the shape of their skull, the strength of their neck, other bodily injuries, is going to have a different kind of damage to the brain. It's been said that saying brain injury is about as specific as saying body injury. And so I think that explains there why people are so different from each other. So in the images that you're seeing on your screen, I've showed 3 different cartoon views in the upper right of parts of the brain that are typically damaged. So the parts that are right over your nose, basically your nasal sinuses in the frontal lobes, are often damaged just because that's the sharpest part of the skull, and a lot of accidents are in motor vehicle crashes. Also in this image in the lower left, that's an undersurface of a brain with brain damage. You can see there's bleeding all along those surfaces. And then the bottom right image is a lateral view of the head MRI. And again, you can see that those parts of the brain at the front tend to be quite damaged. So depending on the cause, those are different outcomes from brain injury. So as I said, the effects of the damage depend on the type of injury it was. So and the effects on behavior and thinking and moving are also going to depend on where the brain damage was and how much the brain was damaged. But there are some common things we see in people with brain injury. Catherine and I put vision and hearing loss at the top of the list here. So speech pathology and audiology are linked professions, and it's pretty stunning how rarely people ask about hearing loss and brain injury compared to how commonly it happens. So hearing loss can happen from blood in the ear. It can happen from a skull fracture. It can happen from brain damage. There's lots of reasons. Likewise, vision can happen from something in the eye or something in the brain. So when you're thinking about interacting with someone with a brain injury, the first and easiest thing to do is to make sure they get screened. So it can also cause other bodily or somatic signs and symptoms like weakness, losing feeling, especially loss of coordination. That's very common because the part of the brain that helps control coordination, the cerebellum, is in a space that tends to get compressed. And then Catherine is an expert in sleep, so certainly changes to bodily functions like sleep. I see a question about when these signs and symptoms happen, immediate or long-term, and I would say both. Mm-hmm. So the ones that I have on this list are the chronic problems, because those are the people who you're likely dealing with, but those things also will be present early after the injury. So for example, if you see someone who had a concussion, you might actually see them only a couple of days after that happened. You will be maybe seeing sleep disturbance and some changes in their vision, ringing in their ears, things like that. But they do persist into the long-term post-injury. On the cognitive side, there are some very specific problems, and we wanted to just take a minute to talk about those problems because sometimes people make general statements like brain injury affects memory, but it doesn't affect all types of memory, or brain injury affects executive functions, but how people define that can be different. And so, so these are the three big things that you commonly see across people with brain injury, again, persisting into the chronic stage post-injury. So memory, but specifically memory for some time period before the injury. So usually people have this period of amnesia or a loss of conscious memories from the injury back a few hours, a few days, it can even be a few months. But most important when it comes to the justice system, difficulty learning new information. So people typically can learn new habits pretty easily, but conscious learning of new information and keeping in mind things like your new court dates or things you have to do for your extrajudicial sanctions, that kind of new learning is problematic, as well as that kind of learning in school. So a lot of people really struggle in school. The second big type of impairment is impairments in executive functions, which I'll talk about in a sec. And the third is overall slowed thinking and reaction time. And we talk about in communication between turns, other than on Zoom, between turns of people talking, you talking and me talking, there's zero overlap. I mean, there's zero lag time. It's actually like a 250 millisecond overlap between people talking. A person who's not quick thinking may actually still be trying to sort out your last sentence when you're on to the next sentence. So that's what we mean by thinking speed and slower reaction time. Catherine mentioned one of the biggest predictors of a brain injury is having had a previous one. And that's because the brain injury, the first one slowed reaction time. So the person is slower to respond for the next brain injury. Catherine, may I ask you to advance?
Yes.
Thank you. So I put this graphic, and Catherine and I were talking about this is a very full of information graphic, but in doing previous trainings, people have found that this kind of makes sense to them. It's by a Canadian researcher, Adele Diamond, who is quite famous for studying the development of executive functions. So we use this term executive function, but really it's three different cognitive functions that help you achieve goals in your life. I mean, that's what executive functions do. They help you get things done. You all have outstanding executive functions because you're here at this talk. You organized yourself, you scheduled your day, you've got the registration information. So they're the types of thinking that let you do that. Anyway, what you'll see in this diagram is a box that says working memory.
Okay, so I'll put my cursor there.
Thank you, Catherine. And working memory is what's on your mind. So if you're thinking about things while you're listening to us, you're planning ahead, those things are on your mind. if you're going to achieve a goal, you need to be able to hold things in your working memory. Working memory is probably the most common impairment in people with brain injury, the most common area of impairment. Many people with brain injury have trouble holding multiple things in their mind at once, or have trouble even moving things around in their mind. So as an example, if you're scheduling your day, you're thinking, I should do this first, and then I should do this second. This might take a little bit longer. That's using your working memory. And many people, even with mild injuries, have challenges doing that. The second main function is inhibitory control. Thank you, Catherine. And that's really starting and stopping behavior. So being able to stop having those thoughts that keep going around and around in your head, or stop yourself from doing a behavior that you know is not necessarily good for you. Right now, I feel in the pandemic condition, this is where most of us are being the most taxed, because you're having to have control all the time. Now we have to control our house because people are seeing it. Mm-hmm. You have to stop yourself from, or maybe just I do, from going to the fridge like every 30 minutes. So we have lost a lot of our external supports for inhibitory control. So that's the second executive function. The third is cognitive flexibility, being able to switch. So a common thing we hear from people with brain injury and about them is that they get stuck on one idea. They get stuck on one solution. They get stuck on what happened to them, and they can't shift. They're thinking about their own thoughts, and they can't switch to thinking about somebody else's thoughts. And that flexibility, again, is really critical for achieving your goals. So those are the three executive functions. If you have impairments in those, you will have challenges in what we call the higher level things that you and we see all the time, which is being able to reason through something. So you can imagine if you are trying to reason through, say, the consequences of doing something, you need the working memory to hold all that in your mind. You need inhibitory control so you can focus on that and not get distracted thinking about other things. And you need to be flexible because you need to be able to think, well, if I do this, that will happen. But if I do this, that will happen. And a mentor of Catherine's and mine, Mark Ilvasaker, used to say that people with brain injury are caught on the horns of a dilemma. And he would say, because most of us solve problems either through reasoning or memory. And often people with brain injury have challenges in both. And so reasoning, problem solving, planning ahead, those are what you do with your working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. Now, an important point about these executive functions is that they continue to develop through the first at least 25 years of life. So you know that small children have them if you've ever been manipulated by a 3-year-old. So you know that kids can do executive functions. It's not like they appear at 25 or 26, but they're definitely in a protracted period of development. We talk about executive functions as last in, first out. So they develop over a very long period, but sadly for those of us who are over 40, they start to decline at around 40. And you rely more on your wisdom and your habits after 40, because your ability to do these like constant high level computations can start to decline at 40. So, but the protracted development also means if you injure them in the process, they cannot develop. So if a child has an injury, a brain injury at age 10, 11, 12, they may actually not develop adult-like reasoning and problem solving. And when Catherine mentioned that one of the challenges in places like justice is that the injury is remote, is that you may be seeing an adult and not know that the reason that adult is the way they are in terms of their reasoning skills was from something that might have happened 20 years ago. So executive functions are not only something you develop, but they're what you use to learn other things. So by having self-control and flexibility and working memory, you can decide what to study at school. You can study it, you can advance it, you can get a job and keep a job. So they're critical for multiple reasons. Next slide, please, Catherine.
My pleasure.
Yes, and so this is just reiterating that last slide. Many people talk about executive functions as synonymous with the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes indeed are the last part of the brain to develop. However, I want to emphasize that a person does not need to have a frontal lobe injury to have problems with executive function. And a classic example is ADHD. So attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is described as a disorder of executive function, but there is no lesion. So and there aren't even good findings that frontal lobes of people with ADHD are different than they are for people without ADHD. So you don't have to be looking for a lesion. And as Catherine's last point here is, because the demands on executive functions go up over time, someone who's injured young might look fine at 11, but behaving like an 11-year-old at 16 may no longer be fine. So there's an expression in brain injury from a woman named Marilyn Lash: time reveals all wounds. And that's something that we talk about a lot. Next, please, Catherine. Now we're going to do an activity to simulate the feeling of how much work it is to have executive function. So we're going to assume that everyone is alone. If you're not, and you're with someone else, I'll tell you what to do about that in a second. We're going to ask you to take a minute, make sure your microphone is muted, and talk about your weekend plans. You need to talk for a full 60 seconds. I'm going to be timing you. But in this talking for 60 seconds, you cannot use the word and or the word the. So no and, oh, thank you. Then, sorry, no and no then. If you are with another person, ask them to monitor you and count up if you ever break the rule. So when I tell you to start, I'm just gonna set my timer here. When I tell you to start, I would like you to describe what you are planning to do this weekend. Make sure you take a full minute. I'll stop you when it's time to stop and not use the words and then. If you could back up one slide. Sorry, I forgot to use one slide.
Absolutely.
Catherine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right now, rate your level of mental energy from 0, like I am barely functioning, to 10, I am full of mental energy. So just to yourself, think of where you are on the scale, what you could tackle mentally. Okay, thank you, Catherine. Next slide.
My pleasure. I just wanted to add, yes, we do know that you're going to be sitting in your room at home talking out loud to yourself, and that's okay. This is an exercise. So shut the door, and if any of your kids come by and say, Mom or Dad, what are you doing? It's all for work.
You can have them do it afterward.
You can have them do it after, yeah.
Okay, and go. So this, at the end of that task, you should have felt some kind of mental fatigue from doing it. So you should feel what we say as should feel a little bit depleted from doing it. A young man who I've worked with for a while who has a brain injury said, how you felt in trying to have that, trying to do that without using and then is how he feels all day, every day. That level of mental energy that it takes him just to do anything. And thank you to the person who just disclosed that they made mistakes a couple of times. Sometimes when people get really tired, their strategy is just to ignore the rule completely. And that might be something you hear from people with brain injury as well. If I could have the next slide, Catherine.
Sure. Before we advance to the next slide, I just wanted to comment. It's interesting that one or two of you did notice that you felt energized. And I would like to comment that it may well be energized, but I think what it also might have been was it increased your arousal, because all of you are sitting quietly while Lynn and I are doing all the work right now. So that's probably what happened, that you all of a sudden you sort of had to engage your brain again, rather than increasing your actual energy. You probably raised your level of arousal, but I could be wrong.
Nope, that totally makes sense. So stimulating, right, it was stimulating, so you felt more. So perhaps we should have done it for a longer time.
next week. Next week.
Next week. Yeah, next week we'll do it for a longer time. So this task is a version of the marshmallow test, which you might have heard about. The marshmallow test it's a funny video if you want to watch it, but the idea, the theory, and the science behind it is that self-control is a limited resource. So we all have only a certain amount of self-control. If you're using it all day, you run out. And in my lab, we always joke that that's why there's happy hour, because people have been on their best behavior all day at work, right? So it would be exhausting if you had to do this all the time. So, and again, I feel like in our Zoom life right now, in our online life, this is kind of what it's like, because you're trying to control so many things in your environment, where at work you had maybe one thing, you didn't have your kids like running around behind, and you're trying to figure out all these things. So this phenomenon we call self-regulation fatigue, where people just they just run out of mental energy to control themselves. And so one thing I encourage you to think about is what you think this fatigue would look like in clients or in yourself. And yes, Lalia, that is why diets fail. In fact, that's the science behind why diets are failing. And another time we could talk all about that self-control. So Catherine, may I have the next slide, please?
You can. Again, I just wanted to add one very brief comment. For those of us who have been spending a lot of time using Zoom, and Lynn alluded to the concept of fatigue, and perhaps some of you have in fact heard of Zoom fatigue. And both Lynn and I have been teaching students at various universities using Zoom, and I well remember the first couple of lectures that I did on Zoom where I couldn't really see people's faces like I can't right now. So you're kind of lacking that. And just the mental energy involved really gives you a sense of what it feels like to have a brain injury, because I literally remember the first class I taught on Zoom remotely, and it was a 2-hour class, and at the end of the 2 hours I literally had to go and lie down on my bedroom floor for 10 minutes and not move before I could get my energy back. So that cognitive fatigue is really challenging.
It is. So just to wrap up my section before I turn it back over to Catherine, hopefully doing this task also showed you some ways that communication can be affected by challenging thinking. So it's likely when you were doing your 1 minute of talking that you weren't talking the way you normally would. So having those challenges can affect how you can follow information in a conversation, how you can generate like a story to explain yourself, how you can use language and be flexible and respond to cues in the environment. So to show respect here, show remorse there, show, commitment here, being able to just tell your own story, your own account of what your actions were, and being able to stay in the moment in a communication interaction and not be distracted. So that all of these challenges are going to be the focus for next time. Oh, yes. So thank you for the question about youth who were exposed to trauma. So that is something that would definitely be worth discussing in another session. So yes, absolutely. A stressful or traumatic environment affects brain development, can affect development of executive function, but it can just affect also children's ability to think. It can affect their ability to encode new information. Stress affects the part of the brain that's responsible for you encoding new memories. So people who are very stressed can just not remember things that they should be remembering. So yes, so the psychological trauma literature has some very similar themes to the traumatic brain injury, physical trauma literature. Absolutely.
And we will speak more about that next week. It's a very important question. Thank you.
Great. And I think the last slide from my bit is the summary. Oh, sorry. You know what, Catherine, what do you think if we skip over these for the moment? We do want to talk, it's important to talk about literacy. This is just an overview graphic showing all the ways that TBI can affect a person. So thinking on the bottom, the main thinking problems we've talked about, but also things that we haven't talked about yet, like emotional response and social thinking that we'll talk more about next time. Every aspect of communication, listening, speaking, reading, writing, thinking, using words, and overall control of behavior.
So the question here, does everyone with TBI have these problems? And the answer is no, not necessarily. As Lynn referred to earlier, she said that saying someone has a traumatic brain injury is saying someone is like saying someone has a bodily injury. And that's what makes brain injury so interesting, is that people are very heterogeneous. And yes, we certainly see similarities among people with brain injuries, but we see lots of differences too. And there are very, very many individual differences based on your background, the nature of the lesion, the extent of the damage, your age, your level of education, comorbidities, etc. So just because someone has a brain injury doesn't mean they're exactly the same as the next person. So what we also know is that, as I mentioned earlier, just because someone has a mild brain injury doesn't mean that it's necessarily mild. It can be, but it also doesn't mean that severe injury means it's a life sentence and the person's life is no more. We know that individuals with very severe injuries can in fact have a good outcome, but it takes a village. And on the left, you will see comedian Tracy Anderson, whom some of you may know, who had a severe injury as a result of a crash. He was in a limousine and he had a severe crash. And on the right, we see Kevin Pierce, who was an Olympic snowboarder who had a very severe traumatic brain injury just before the 2010 Olympics. And both of those individuals have actually made a good outcome. Have they returned to their pre-injury selves? No, they have not, but they are both happy, leading very successful, fulfilling lives. And the reason for that is because they had immediate access to top-level medical care. They had financial resources, they had rehabilitation resources, they had families, they do have families who support them every step of the way. And particularly for Kevin Pierce, his brother actually quit his job to spend full-time working in rehabilitation with Kevin. And Kevin has gone on to, he and his brother have actually developed a program called Love Your Brain Yoga, which is a yoga specifically for individuals with brain injury. And it is actually offered here in Toronto and across Canada. And right now it's being offered online. So there are two take-home messages from that. One is that severe injury can have a good outcome. Absolutely, as I said, it's not a life sentence. But the second is that one of the things that we know it makes a huge difference is having the family support and access to rehabilitation. And those are two of the key determinants of successful outcomes. And we know that that is, of course, very different from many of the clients that you work with that don't necessarily have that family support, that have the financial resources, and so they may not necessarily have that outcome. So I'm going to flip through this. Concussion, we've talked about the fact that mild may not necessarily be mild. A concussion is a brain injury. Most people resolve quickly within 1 to 3 months, but not everyone does. So we know that approximately 15% of people who have a concussion will experience what we call persistent symptoms. We also know that youth are slower to recovery, and that the greatest risk factor is a previous concussion. So I'm going to just skip over that for now. I'm also going to skip over this. I'm going to skip over this. We will try to get to it next week. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a risk for long-term repeat hits to the head. Part of the reason we put that up there is that another vulnerable group that are at risk of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, there have been no studies done yet, but these are survivors of intimate partner violence. And you may have some of those on your caseload. So brain injury, attempted strangulation, and repeat hits to the head are quite prominent within that population. So what else do we know about brain injury? What's important here is that traumatic brain injury is a chronic disease. With the exception of most single concussions, people are not cured of their TBIs. And you would be amazed at how many, even I still do a small private practice, and how many insurance adjusters or even family members will say, well, when is my loved one going to be cured? Or how come they're not cured by now? Or the judge in the US who commented to a colleague of ours, well, he'd had a concussion, so he really didn't understand what the big deal was, because, you know, he recovered fine. So with the exception of most concussions, people are not cured of their TBI. People live with brain injury, and brain injury also happens to the family, not just to the individual. And we talked about that people can grow into their brain injuries because it is in fact a neurodevelopmental disability. So we would just throw this out there for you to think about going forward, knowing that traumatic brain injury is chronic, it's not curable, but individuals can be successful with the proper supports. That what should the justice system do differently? And we'll take some time to talk about that next week.
Great. So what is the ABI System Navigator? So, you know, it's a role that's directed to improve access to services for those living with the effects of an acquired brain injury. So we use ABI quite a bit in our statements here. So, you know, it includes supporting ABI individuals with concurrent disorders, including mental health, addictions, and developmental delays. And ABI navigators help to highlight the need for integrated care, particularly for those with the complex needs. And, you know, we have access to the provincial funders and also the ministry as a group. And so, you know, it's important for us as a group to advocate to these two areas. And I may have to look at your questions after I say my slide. I can't do two things at once. Sorry. So
that's okay.
Yeah, you know, there's one ABI navigator that's assigned to each LIN, as Catherine had mentioned earlier. I should mention that except for the Erie St. Clair LIN, they do have a contact there, but they don't have a navigator. But the navigators are experts in supporting individuals in their own geographical region. So we also have we're very familiar with what's available for individuals, families, and service providers. And so that's sort of where we can be of assistance. I do state here that for now we're divided by LIN, and that's due to, you know, all the restructuring that the province is currently doing with the Ontario health teams. We're doing our best to try to have an ABI voice at some of the mental health and addiction Ontario health teams and their working groups. Because ABI is not on the forefront right now for OHT, so we're you know, a lot of the navigators are working on that angle. I also want to mention too, you know, navigators can work in varying full-time or part-time roles too. So with the contact list I included with the presentation today, you may or may not be able to get in everyone right away. So some work only, you know, 1 or 2 days a week. And I know sometimes cases can be, you know, a little bit on the complex and urgent side. So it's important to keep a couple of those things in mind. But, you know, as a group, we come together to share our experiences, like provincially. We share resources, we identify possible champions who can assist with system gaps and advocacy for system change. We collaborate on projects together, and we really like try to impact long-term ABI service changes. So, you know, individually we may not have all the answers, but as a group, we definitely work together to problem solve. And as I mentioned, you know, we do have monthly meetings as well as retreats, and we actually have a ministry rep that attends our retreats. So we do have, you know, a voice in the ministry that is listening to some of the system gaps and the things that are challenging with our ABI population. So the next slide. Thanks, Catherine. I did want to just briefly mention, so I do work in the Toronto Central LIN, and I have a dual role as the ABI referral coordinator at the Toronto ABI Network. And you know, the Toronto ABI Network is a recognized leader and collective voice in ABI. And we do bring together providers from across the healthcare and social services continuum. And our main focus is to make sure that individuals and families can access publicly funded services fairly. And so, you know, just as an example, we have a centralized referral system. I manage over 1,200 referrals in a year, as well as managing over 1,300 calls in 2019. And so the navigator and the referral coordinating role mesh together really nicely. I did include our website here, which does have access to our referral form for any of you that do work in the Toronto Central LHIN, for you to reach out if you have any questions. And then the next slide, we're talking a little bit about the goals of the ABI System Navigator. So, you know, two of our most prominent roles are that we provide resource navigation. And, you know, as I mentioned about being knowledgeable about what in our own areas, but we like to promote information sharing and establish linkages through the collaboration in an effort to reduce the barriers and provide access to service. And as we discussed, you know, as Catherine and Lynn were discussing about some of the barriers and challenges that this population has, you know, this is something that we definitely support and try to focus on. And, you know, we collaborate not only with ABI providers, but with non-ABI service providers, including mental health addictions, developmental delay, corrections, and housing sectors. And also, we have experience with complex case navigation. And so some cases can have individuals that have significant physical or behavioral ABI challenges. And then sometimes the comorbidities can raise the level of complexity. Mm-hmm. And so having, you know, so sometimes there's tables, you know, resolution tables, there's teams that work together. And so having an ABI navigator at the table and or having a connection with a navigator to connect you to services can really help support and have a voice for that aspect when a complex case is needed. I should mention, though, that navigators, we don't provide one-to-one case management, but we do help with the next steps. And then the next slide. Thanks, Catherine. So what can a system navigator provide? So we can provide ABI education or in-services on general ABI information, or we have most often like a bird's eye view of the ABI service pathways within our regions. And so we can also provide resource information. We know about how to make connections and likely referral sources and how to make the proper navigation as for service providers. So we're really there to try to help you figure out how to navigate the ABI part. And the case-specific discussion is similar to the 2 points that I made earlier, but the complex case navigation is definitely can be a challenge. And so, you know, when an ABI navigator is involved, they do also participate and have knowledge from their participation with the Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committees, the Ontario Health Working Teams. Navigators also understand the impact of ABI in individuals, their cognitive, physical, and psychosocial abilities, and so they can be an asset in a handful of these ways. And then the last slide that I have is, when do you contact an ABI system navigator? So if you have a client with a confirmed ABI diagnosis or perhaps a suspected diagnosis and they're not connected to ABI services, that would be a good time to give the navigators a call. And I did include the contact list I mentioned. And the last point on the slide, there's also access to it through the ABI Network website. A quick tip as well, if you're not quite sure about the LHIN or the local health integration net, like the area that your client's living in, there is a postal code search website that you can look up for your client, and then you can get a better idea of which navigator to call on the list. But you know, if you'd like support or a specific client consultation, you can absolutely give us a call as well. My contact information is on the first slide. So for those that are in the Toronto regional area, it's definitely possible to give me a call. And I, even if you're not sure, I can also, you know, navigate you to the proper LIN. I can give you a hand as well. So please feel free to give us a call. And yeah, I think. And then the last slide is, I did put my contact information on the last slide. So one more, yeah. And then access to the contact list.
Okay,
So
thank you so much. Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you. That's so helpful. So I really urge all of you to reach out to your LIN navigators. They're a fantastic resource. I also wanted to just share something that's literally just hot off the presses. Just as I was getting ready to sign on for the webinar, I received an email from actually the head ABI LIN navigator who had let me know and Lynn know earlier this summer that they are trying to strike some kind of a working group to do more advocacy for people in the justice system with brain injury, because they recognize that that's a big gap and that's a really underserviced population. So that is something that is getting off the ground. So we really hope that we're really starting the ball rolling here to improve services. All right, so how do you think these challenges would affect your interactions with your client and their trajectory across the justice system? I'm just going to throw that. How would these impairments or these challenges, or what are you seeing within your own clients? And Lynn,
or even how are they currently? So yeah, I see the chat, Catherine. So
okay, I don't know why I can't see it for some reason. Oh, there we go. That's why. Yes. They get breached more often for non-compliance. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Involvement.
Yeah.
There's actually an article that came out of Hugh Williams' group that looks specifically at recidivism rates being higher if someone has a TBI, partly related to the first point, which is that they are non-compliant more often.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing too is that there's evidence to show that the nature of the crime is often more severe for individuals with brain injury. Yes, Deb, absolutely. Difficult to gather information, overwhelming, that information processing. Yes, Matt, your comment. We're going to talk about that next week so much. All of these impairments are always, if the understanding of brain injury is not there, misinterpreted. Absolutely.
Right.
Yes, difficulty applying for ODSP. Absolutely. Yeah. All of these things. Absolutely. In terms of things like ODSP, housing, etc., one of the on the list of resources that I sent out to you today, I included the Ontario Brain Injury Association, Brain Injury Canada, Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, the Brain Injury Society of Toronto. Every region has a Brain Injury Society, and the Brain Injury Society of Toronto is phenomenal. They are absolutely amazing. And certainly at BIST, they do have case management to help individuals apply for ODSP. They have case management to support looking for housing, et cetera, because we know a lot of these individuals fall outside the cracks and they are difficult to house. Another great resource, of course, that I'm sure all of you are familiar with is the John Howard Society and Elizabeth Fry Societies. And we work closely with John Howard Society of Toronto. And yes, the comment about school behavior, significant educational gaps, absolutely. That's a huge issue. And when we talk next week, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, as you in the, those of you who are on the call, I'm sure have experienced, because these problems can be kind of hard to get your arms around, hard for people in traditional school settings to understand what an executive function impairment looks like as a new problem. Sometimes they're like discharged from a caseload and not even receiving any kinds of therapy services or accommodations in school.
Yeah, so I'm just going to comment on two things. Gareth, I'm going to reply to your comment because it's a very good question. The short answer is yes. absolutely. All the brain injury societies are across the lifespan. So absolutely. In terms of this, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, Catherine, just to follow up on that. But I will say that it's wonderful that services are available, but we have a huge gap in knowledge about outcomes for people over 65. So
True.
with the shift in the economy and more people working to an older age, we have the extra problem of people who previously, especially if you look in the stroke literature, might have thought they'd be retired anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So at 65, things like work were not as big an issue, but now we're having this big growing population of people over 65 who are still really active, hence the injuries. But we actually have very little information about what the best way is to help those people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, aging with a disability across the lifespan and aging with a brain injury, and also susceptibility to dementia increases as well. Okay.
One thing we should mention is that Catherine and I are doing this as part of a grant from the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, which was indicated on our first slide, but screening questions are the main objective of the grant. So well, these are great questions.
Okay. Okay, yeah, all of these are great questions. I'll just quickly say that no, you don't need a medical scan per se to diagnose a traumatic brain injury. It can be done through a history taking, through a physician. Neuropsychologists are also able to diagnose a traumatic brain injury. And it is possible to retrospectively diagnose a brain injury. We do know that that is a big gap. It's a big barrier in terms of accessing services because a lot of these individuals don't have a diagnosis. That's where, again, you can reach out to your LIN navigators. And in Toronto, we've recently partnered with the Inner City Family Health team, who have kindly agreed to work with clients from the John Howard Society of Toronto with suspected history of brain injury to walk through and, where appropriate, give them a diagnosis so that they can access services, because that is a barrier. So that's a great question. So you can diagnose a traumatic brain injury retrospectively through a physician, through history taking, neurological examination, et cetera, and by a neuropsychologist. I believe they're the only ones that are able to diagnose, and Lynn, perhaps you could clarify, or
correct.
Julie.
Yeah, that's correct right now. Right, Julie?
That's
okay.
Great. The navigators also, some of them do use the HELPS brain injury screening tool as well. It's a one-page tool, and that would be more along the lines of the suspected. So it wouldn't be the actual confirmed diagnosis, but suspected diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. So what we can do, we're actually in Toronto, I'm involved in another grant, again, working with John Howard Society of Toronto, and we are actually implementing the HELPS for all of their clients. So I will send out the HELPS along with resources for next week. It's a fairly short interview that you can use with your clients.